In this movie, we'll look at how you can decompose an activity into a more detailed diagram at the next level down. We'll look at how activities are decomposed, the activity parameters that show the values passed in and out, actions in structured activities, and interruptible regions, which group actions together but aren't activities. Activities are shown in activity diagrams if they're structured activities, and we're hiding the detail of their internal workflow at one level, but showing it in a more detailed diagram. So the activity test physical device in the add a device activity diagram can be broken down into more detail, which is shown in another activity diagram, where test physical device contains the actions at that more detailed level. We use activity parameters on an activity, represented as rectangles on the edge of the activity, and we use them to show the values that are passed into it and out of it. These may be objects or other values that are associated with the pins on the higher level diagram. We show actions in activities when we've reached the level at which we don't need to or can't decompose the workflow any further. Actions receive values as object flows starting at the activity parameters and pass values out as object flows to activity parameters. Interruptible regions in an activity diagram show a grouping of activities or actions that could be interrupted by an event. They're shown as a dashed round-cornered rectangle, but are not an activity or action. They include something that interrupts the flow in that region, which is normally a signal, which we'll cover in the next movie, so I've shown an action here. There's a flow out from the interrupting event that is shown as a zigzag or lightning bolt arrow. In this case, it goes to a flow final node, which terminates that flow without affecting the other parallel flow. Let's put this into practice in Enterprise Architect. Here we are in the activity diagram for add a device, the version using swim lanes. We'll add a lower level diagram into this. We're going to decompose the activity test physical device. I start by selecting the activity, right-clicking on it, and selecting New Child Diagram, and then Composite Structure Diagram. You can see the activity now has an icon in the lower right. This shows that it has a lower level diagram that shows the internal structure of its behavior. The icon is Enterprise Architect's notation and isn't strictly speaking UML. We could add a structured activity from the toolbox. I'll add one in and then delete it. I select Structured Activity in the toolbox and then click on the diagram. It asks me what kind of structured activity I want, and I select Other. At this point, if I select Simple Composite, it will give me an activity with that same icon that is using the Enterprise Architect notation. If I select Structured Activity node, click OK, it will give me the UML notation for a structured activity node, which has the dashed line around it and has the stereotype structured at the top of it. We don't need this, so I'll just delete it. I need to delete it in the project browser. If I just delete it from the diagram, it will still be part of the model. So let's go into the new diagram. I can double click on Test Physical Device, and it will take me into its diagram at the lower level. Now, I could just draw an activity diagram here with no containing activity, but I want to show the activity parameters on the edge of that containing activity. So I'm going to drag the activity from the project browser onto the diagram here as a link. I could have the pins shown on the outside if I select them here, but I don't want to. So there's Test Physical Device. I'm going to add some activity parameters. If we look at the sequence diagram for test device, which we created in a different movie, we can see that at the point that a device is being tested, the parameter that's being passed in is actually the X10 address, which is a string. So the activity parameter here doesn't need the entire object device, it just needs a string to be passed in. Let's add that first activity parameter. I select New Child Element and then Activity Parameter from the context menu. I'll call it Device Address. And in the parameter page in this dialog, I can set the type to be string. The direction is in, which is correct. I'll move it onto that side. I'll do the same for device exists as a Boolean output. I change it to Boolean, and I change the direction to out. I'll move it onto the right of the activity. I need to change the input pin on the add a device diagram to match the input parameter here now. It isn't a class and I don't have string in my model, so I'll just select none. So now I've got device address coming in on the pin and device exists going out on the other pin. And I've got device address as an activity parameter coming into my activity and device exists as an activity parameter going out of my activity. Now I can add some actions. The first is start timer. I click on action on the toolbox and then on the diagram. There are various different kinds of actions. I'm just going to use atomic action here, which is the simplest. I call it start timer. I'll draw an object flow in from the parameter start timer. The next is going to be called send message to device. If I draw an object flow from start timer to send message to device, EA will add the pins for me. So these have the same value and type as the activity parameter that's been passed in. So device address, which is a string, and device address is a string there as well. I'll add the rest of this diagram quite quickly now, as we've seen most of this before. I'll add a fork, and then I'll follow that with a number of actions. Receive response, cancel timer, and wait for timeout. I also need two actions to set the values of device exists to pass out to the activity parameter. These can be write variable actions, so I'll add them in and select that. So rather than atomic, I select write variable. And the first one is device exists equals true. And the second is device exists equals false. You can see that these have been labeled as write variable actions. Now I'll connect these all up with control flows up to the point where I want to pass value out through the activity parameter, and those will be object flows. Now I'm going to add the interruptible region. It's labeled as region in the toolbox. I'll click there and drag it onto the diagram. The type I want is an interruptible activity region, and I'll call it timer cancelled. Here it is on the diagram, and I'll drag it into the activity so that it's round wait for timeout and the device exists equals false action. Now I'll add an action called timer cancelled and a flow final node. Then I'll add an interrupt flow from the toolbox from timer cancelled to that flow final node. You can see the zigzag notation that's used there. So in this movie, we've taken an activity at one level in the model and decomposed it into an activity diagram at a lower level, showing the detail of the workflow that makes it up. We've seen how activity parameters are used to pass values into and out of activities, be used by actions. And we've used interruptible regions to interrupt a flow.